Welcome to this explainer, where we are going to break down the brilliant narrative mechanics of The Secret of the Scarlet Clock. We're looking at an absolutely fascinating collision of two iconic investigative minds today. And it's brought together in a way that highlights not just how they solve crimes, but how they actually view the world. So get ready. If you've ever wondered what happens when pure, cold logic meets razor-sharp emotional intelligence, well, you're in the perfect place. Let's get right into it. Okay, let's dive into this defining observation from Dr. Watson's journal. It is the absolute perfect anchor for our micro to macro look at these two legendary minds. You know, Watson, who has spent years chronicling Sherlock's every single move, he realizes almost immediately that Nancy Drew brings something entirely unprecedented to Baker Street. This isn't just a slight difference in style, right? It's a fundamental difference in their investigative philosophy. As he so perfectly puts it, he works from the outside in, and she works from the inside out.
Moving on to Section 1, an unlikely mentorship.
Let's begin by examining that initial clash of personalities. We got 23-year-old Nancy Drew arriving in London to study under Sherlock Holmes. Talk about a setup completely ripe for friction. Nancy, fresh off solving complex financial frauds over in America, shows up not as some subservient student, but really as an intellectual equal, completely ready to challenge his established methods. And this simple metaphor brilliantly illustrates the core friction between them. When Holmes walks into a room, every single surface is a sentence to him. He translates the physical world into data with astonishing speed. But Nancy? She reads the space like a story. She's looking for that human element, the grief, the hidden secrets, the real reasons why someone might be lying. Next up, Section 2, the Camden Square murder. So the ultimate testing ground for these contrasting methods is the Camden Square murder. Wealthy investor Richard Topham is found dead in an empty house, and the scene is just completely baffling. There are no visible wounds, no signs of a struggle, just Topham lying on the floor with a look of absolute horror frozen on his face, and a single chilling word written in blood on the wall. Now, what's really interesting here is the sheer speed and volume of Holmes's method. Look at how he immediately translates the room's physical residue into a profile of the killer. Literally, within minutes of arriving, he's down on his hands and knees, finding an exotic Trichiny police cigar ash and analyzing the stride length of muddy footprints. He maps out the physical reality of the killer, a man over 6 feet tall, wearing size 11 square-toed boots with a specific habit of keeping only his right fingernails long. I mean, it's masterful for sure, but it's really only half the picture. And then there's the message left at the scene. This specific translation trap perfectly highlights Holmes's superiority over Scotland Yard. Predictably, Inspector Lestrade jumps to the most obvious, and frankly, completely wrong conclusion. He assumes the blood on the wall was just an unfinished English name, Rachel. But Holmes calmly steps in and points out the continental stroke of the letters. It's actually Rache, the German word for revenge. Holmes zeroes right in on the linguistic facts, completely dismissing the idea of a woman named Rachel being involved at all. Which brings us to Section 3, 2 investigative methods. But as we've just seen, the physical evidence is only half the story. Back at Baker Street, we hit this fundamental philosophical clash between our two detectives over Holmes's famous Book of Life essay. Nancy directly challenges the very foundation of Holmes's method. She points out that while he can easily account for physical disguises, his science is, well, it's completely blind to emotional concealment. So the crucial point here is how Holmes's outside-in approach of reading physical surfaces directly contrasts with Nancy's inside-out approach of reading human histories and financial relationships. While Holmes is busy testing chemical reagents to trace the killer's boots, Nancy is digging through financial filings. She understands that to catch a killer, you need to deeply understand the human relationships that led to the murder in the first place. Let's look at this timeline. When Nancy traces the financial history, she builds a chronological sequence of the Crowley inheritance, and this exposes the underlying motive that physical evidence alone could never, ever uncover. She discovers that the victim, Richard Topham, was actually borrowing heavily against the estate of an elderly man named Josiah Crowley, 14 months prior, long before Crowley even died. When Crowley finally passes away, leaving his entire estate to the Tophams, the rightful heirs were totally shut out. People who might want, well, revenge. And this is a great reminder for all of us. Following the money is an inside-out tactic we constantly recognize in modern true crime, simply because human motivation leaves a paper trail just as distinct as a muddy footprint. Which brings us to, arguably, the most fascinating piece of evidence. There's a worn gold ring dropped near the body. While Holmes sees this as a careless accident by a hired killer, Nancy views it as a profound emotional signature. It was left by someone grieving a terrible loss. The ring's gold is actually worn thin from years of being anxiously gripped. See, Holmes sees gravity, Nancy sees devotion.
She recognizes that whoever dropped this ring deeply loved the person it belonged to. And that's absolutely the core takeaway here. Pure facts often require profound human empathy to be interpreted correctly. All right, Section 4, the Rance interview.
These parallel threads finally intersect during the questioning of Constable Rance, the officer who first discovered the scene. Holmes and Nancy need more details about the night of the murder, so they visit the defensive, resentful constable at his home. So how do you get a defensive witness to talk? Well, Holmes walks in and immediately starts interrogating the man, making him feel like a suspect. And of course, the constable instantly shuts down. It's a classic Holmes mistake, right? Treating a person like a puzzle to be solved, rather than a human being with an ego and complex feelings. Rance feels totally ignored by his own institution, which forces Nancy to step in and deploy her specific inside-out skill set to get him to genuinely open up. Watch exactly how Nancy takes control here. She executes these deliberate steps in just 15 seconds, completely neutralizing the constable's defensiveness and opening the door for vital new information. First, she sits at a careful, non-confrontational angle to create a safe space. Then, she validates his police work, telling him they are there specifically because his report was the most competent one filed. By framing the visit as a follow-up on his competence rather than a correction of his failure, she gets Rance to relax. She waits patiently through the debris field of his story for hidden details to surface. Honestly, this sequence isn't just about solving murders. It's a literal masterclass in empathetic communication that you can use in any defensive conversation in your own life.
And here is the incredible payoff. Because she creates this safe space, Rance reveals something huge. He saw a tall, heavily coated man at the gate, feigning drunkenness while quietly repeating a name. Rance had initially just dismissed the man as a local drunk. It's absolutely amazing how Nancy's patient probing unlocked a vital, game-changing clue that sheer, cold deduction completely missed. They instantly realized this was the killer, returning to the scene of the crime to frantically search for that dropped gold ring.
Moving to Section 5, a combined approach.
Standing right outside Rance's house, the pieces finally click together for both of them. Holmes's physical evidence and Nancy's emotional context aren't competing theories anymore. They are two halves of the exact same truth. This revelation forces Holmes and Nancy to finally synthesize their investigative frameworks into a single, unified lens to capture a complete portrait of the killer. Holmes realizes the drunk man was actually completely sober, betraying himself by keeping his hands perfectly still in his pockets, a brilliant physical observation. But Nancy provides the crucial emotional leak. He was mumbling because he was a grieving individual, compelled to return to the scene for a loved one's worn ring, and he just couldn't keep that loved one's name inside. This narrative really demonstrates that true investigative mastery requires both reading the room like a text and reading the people like a story. Holmes found the what, and Nancy found the why. Holmes can tell you exactly what the killer looks like, what kind of cigars he smokes, and what kind of boots he wears. But Nancy? She can tell you who he loved, why he is grieving, and why he needed Richard Topham dead. Together, they are completely unstoppable. So as we wrap up this explainer, we're left with a massive question. Whose name was exactly being mumbled in the dark? And how will the physical profile of the hired killer finally intersect with the emotional grief of the missing suspect? Could the name the killer was murmuring actually be Rachel, the very woman Holmes dismissed as a linguistic error, but Nancy suspected was a wronged heir? To find out, you'll just have to see how their synthesized methods unravel the rest of this brilliant mystery. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive, and remember, keep your eyes and your empathy wide open.